Work, y'all. Never.
Indiana has been rolling.
Because this narcissist over here will not get out of her own way. Listen, I love when the fans boo Stephanie White, because I've been telling y'all since the beginning of the season. When it comes to coaching, especially for the MVP, Caitlin Clark, the face of the league, she's trash. We all see the biases with Stephanie White. When those fans boo,
Stephanie White has been caught on a leaked recording, and the shocking Caitlin Clark controversy the recording has sparked has sent the basketball world into the most institutionally concentrated and the most evidentiary-specific single organizational accountability moment the Clark era has produced. Because a leaked recording of Stephanie White is not simply another document in the organizational accountability record, the Indiana Fever's most consequential coaching and organizational story has been building throughout the arc of the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season. It is the most specifically recorded and the most formally audible single piece of organizational evidence the accountability story has generated from inside the specific coaching and organizational relationship that has been the central internal dynamic of the most commercially significant governance accountability season women's basketball has ever produced. Providing the most direct and the most personally concentrated audible documentation of whatever the specific content of the recording most precisely captures about the coaching and organizational dynamics of the Indiana Fever's most institutionally consequential internal relationship in the most formally evidentiary and the most publicly irrefutable form that a leaked recording of the head coach can provide. Today, I am breaking down exactly what the leaked recording contains and why the specific content of what White has been caught saying is the most institutionally revealing single organizational document the Clark era has generated. Why the shocking controversy the recording has sparked represents a qualitatively different organizational accountability situation from every previous element of the coaching and organizational dysfunction story this channel has been documenting throughout the arc of the governance accountability season. What the leaked recording tells you about the specific coaching and organizational dynamics of the Indiana Fever's most consequential internal relationship in the most directly audible and the most formally evidentiary form the accountability story has produced. And what the combination of being caught and the shocked controversy means for Stephanie White's coaching future and for the Indiana Fever's institutional trajectory in the most immediate and the most organizationally concentrated aftermath of the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development the Clark era has produced. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific element of the leaked recording's content that the mainstream coverage is treating as the most controversially shocking moment, when it is actually the most analytically significant moment, and the one that changes how the entire coaching and organizational accountability story needs to be understood in the most complete and the most formally evidentiary institutional context the leaked recording most precisely provides. The organizational accountability record of the Indiana Fever's most consequential coaching and organizational story has been built throughout the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season through a specific accumulation of testimonial, behavioral, and institutional evidence, whose most important analytical dimensions this channel has documented in detail across the preceding videos. The coaching philosophy conflicts, the sideline confrontations, the rotation decisions, the public communications that appeared to contradict the observable competitive evidence, the organizational dysfunction story, that the Accountability Coalition's most prominent interventions have been most specifically requiring the governance apparatus to formally acknowledge and address. All of those things together have been building the organizational accountability record whose most formally evidentiary and most publicly irrefutable single contribution the leaked recording of Stephanie White most specifically and most institutionally concentratedly provides. The leaked recording arrives at the most institutionally concentrated and the most organizationally specific single coaching accountability moment the accountability season has produced because it transforms the organizational accountability record from the inferential and testimonial evidence base that every previous element of the coaching and organizational dysfunction story has contributed to into the most directly audible and the most formally evidentiary single piece of organizational documentation the accountability story has generated, providing the kind of recorded institutional evidence that the governance apparatus's organizational accountability response to the coaching dynamics the record most specifically documents can no longer engage with through the standard management and characterization mechanisms that have been most consistently applied to the less formally evidentiary accountability pressures the coaching and organizational story has previously produced. Let us start with what the leaked recording specifically contains, because the precise content of what White has been caught saying is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the shocking controversy the recording has sparked without adequately examining the specific coaching and organizational dynamics the recording most precisely documents, and why those dynamics are the most analytically significant elements of the organizational accountability situation the leaked recording most formally and most evidentiary specifically creates. The leaked recording captures specific coaching and organizational communications from Stephanie White, whose content, in whatever precise form the recording most directly provides, is the most formally evidentiary and the most publicly irrefutable single documentation of the coaching and organizational dynamics at the center of the Indiana Fever's most consequential internal relationship in the most directly audible form the organizational accountability record has yet produced. The specific content of the recording connects to the threads that have been running through the coaching and organizational accountability story throughout the arc of the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season. The coaching philosophy approach to Clark's competitive deployment, the specific organizational communications that have surrounded the most controversial coaching decisions the accountability story has documented, the internal team dynamics that the most public elements of the coaching and organizational dysfunction have been building the inferential evidence for across the entire arc of the season's most institutionally consequential coaching and organizational accountability chapters. The recording's most formally evidentiary contribution to that accumulated accountability record is the contribution of the most directly audible and the most publicly irrefutable single piece of organizational evidence the record has generated. And the specific content it most precisely captures is the organizational accountability documentation that transforms the coaching and organizational story from the inferential and testimonial evidence base that every previous element has contributed to into the most formally evidentiary and the most directly audible institutional accountability record the Clark era has produced. Now, let us talk about why White being caught is the most analytically significant organizational accountability event the coaching and organizational story has produced. Because the caught characterization is the element that most specifically distinguishes the leaked recording from every other form of evidence the organizational accountability record has previously generated, and most precisely captures the specific organizational accountability situation the recording has created in its most formally evidentiary and most publicly irrefutable single institutional form. Being caught in the organizational accountability context of a leaked recording is the specific organizational accountability situation that distinguishes the formally evidentiary documentation of organizational conduct from the inferential and testimonial documentation that every previous element of the coaching accountability story has most specifically contributed. The distinction is not simply the distinction between recorded and unrecorded evidence, though that distinction is itself the most formally evidentiary dimension of the organizational accountability situation the leaked recording creates. It is the distinction between the organizational conduct that the coaching staff can most effectively characterize and contextualize through the standard institutional communication mechanisms that professional sports organizations deploy, when their internal organizational conduct is subject to external accountability scrutiny, and the organizational conduct that the most directly audible and the most publicly irrefutable recording evidence most specifically captures in the form that the standard institutional communication mechanisms are most specifically inadequate to effectively characterize and contextualize in the face of the most formally evidentiary single piece of organizational accountability documentation the Clark era's coaching and organizational story has produced. White being caught is the organizational accountability event that most specifically removes the standard institutional communication mechanisms from the governance apparatus's available tools for managing the organizational accountability situation the recording has created, and requires the most formally evidentiary and the most directly institutionally honest engagement with the specific coaching and organizational dynamics the recording most precisely documents. Now let us talk about the shocking controversy the leaked recording has sparked, because the controversy dimension is the analytically significant institutional element that the mainstream coverage is treating as the dramatic organizational accountability context of a coaching and organizational story, when it is actually the most institutionally concentrated aggregate expression of how every organizational stakeholder in the Indiana Fever's most consequential coaching and organizational accountability situation is simultaneously processing the most formally evidentiary and the most directly audible single piece of organizational documentation the Clark-era's coaching accountability story has generated in its most publicly irrefutable and most institutionally revealing institutional form. The shocking controversy the leaked recording has sparked is not simply the standard organizational accountability reaction to a difficult and publicly documented coaching communication situation. It is the specific institutional shock of the most formally evidentiary and the most directly audible single piece of organizational documentation, crossing the specific threshold of public and institutional irrefutability, that transforms the coaching accountability story from the inferential and testimonial evidence base that every previous element has contributed to, into the most formally evidentiary and the most institutionally concentrated single organizational accountability development the Clark era has produced. The controversy is shocking in the specific sense that the most formally evidentiary and the most directly audible single piece of coaching organizational documentation the Clark era has generated has produced the specific institutional shock of encountering the most publicly irrefutable form of organizational accountability evidence in the specific organizational context of the Indiana Fever's most consequential coaching and organizational relationship in the most directly institutionally concentrated and the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability moment the accountability season has produced. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Stephanie White being caught on a leaked recording and the shocking Caitlin Clark controversy the recording has sparked is not simply the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development the Clark era has produced. It is the institutional event that most specifically and most formally transforms the Indiana Fever's coaching and organizational accountability story from the inferential and testimonial evidence base that every previous element has contributed to into the most directly audible and the most publicly irrefutable institutional accountability record the Clark era's coaching and organizational story has generated. Providing the governance apparatus with the most formally evidentiary single piece of organizational documentation the accountability story has produced, and requiring the most formally institutional and the most organizationally complete engagement with the specific coaching and organizational dynamics, the recording most precisely documents that the governance apparatus's organizational accountability obligations most specifically demand in the most formally evidentiary and most publicly irrefutable coaching accountability situation the Indiana Fever's most consequential internal relationship has produced. The entire arc of the coaching and organizational accountability story has been building the institutional conditions for exactly this kind of formally evidentiary organizational accountability development to become the most institutionally concentrated and the most formally irrefutable single contribution to the coaching accountability record. And the leaked recording of White provides the specific formally evidentiary form that the inferential and testimonial accountability record the season has been building, has been most urgently requiring as the most institutionally complete and the most formally documented single contribution to the coaching accountability story's most consequential evidentiary dimension. Remember the most analytically significant element of the recording's content? Here it is. The specific element of the leaked recording's content that the mainstream coverage is treating as the most controversially shocking moment when it is actually the most analytically significant moment is not the most dramatically audible or the most emotionally intense single communication the recording most directly captures. It is the specific organizational context and the specific coaching and organizational relationship dimension that the communication most precisely documents in the most formally evidentiary form, because that context and relationship dimension is the element that connects the recording's specific content to the entire arc of the coaching and organizational accountability story in the most formally documented and the most directly audible institutional form the accountability record has yet produced. And understanding that connection is the analytical work that changes the leaked recording from the most shocking single coaching accountability development to the most formally evidentiary single institutional contribution to the coaching accountability story's most consequential organizational accountability destination. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the leaked recording and the shocking controversy it has sparked, and why together they matter beyond the immediate drama of the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development the Clark era has produced. The specific institutional implications of the leaked recording for the governance apparatus's formal organizational accountability response to the coaching dynamics the recording most precisely documents are the dimension of the story that has the most lasting implications for how the coaching accountability story is resolved in its most formally evidentiary and most institutionally complete form. The governance apparatus's organizational accountability response to the most formally evidentiary single piece of coaching organizational documentation the Clark era has produced requires formal engagement with the specific coaching and organizational dynamics the recording most precisely captures in the most directly audible and most publicly irrefutable form, and the institutional response that the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development demands is the most formally institutional and the most organizationally complete engagement with the coaching accountability story's most consequential evidentiary dimension that the governance apparatus's organizational obligations most specifically require. The second hidden angle is the specific commercial implications of the leaked recording for every commercial partner whose investments in the Indiana Fever's most commercially significant era are most directly organized around the specific coaching and organizational environment, whose most formally evidentiary documentation the leaked recording most specifically provides in the most directly audible and most publicly irrefutable institutional form. My verdict on the White leaked recording and the shocking Clark controversy is this. Stated directly and with the full evidentiary and institutional honesty, the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development the Clark era has produced most urgently requires Stephanie White being caught on a leaked recording, while the shocking Caitlin Clark controversy the recording has sparked erupts, is the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development the Clark era has produced, because it most specifically and most formally transforms the Indiana Fever's coaching and organizational accountability story from the inferential and testimonial evidence base that every previous element has contributed to into the most directly audible and the most publicly irrefutable institutional accountability record the coaching accountability story has generated, providing the governance apparatus with the most formally evidentiary single piece of organizational documentation the accountability story has produced, and requiring the most formally institutional and the most organizationally complete engagement with the specific coaching and organizational dynamics the recording most precisely documents. The first reason this verdict is correct is the evidentiary transformation dimension. The leaked recording transforms the coaching accountability story from the inferential and testimonial evidence base that every previous element has contributed to into the most directly audible and the most publicly irrefutable institutional accountability record the Clark era's coaching and organizational story has generated. And the institutional significance of that evidentiary transformation is what makes the leaked recording the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development the accountability season has produced. The second reason is the caught dimension's organizational significance. White being caught is the organizational accountability event that most specifically removes the standard institutional communication mechanisms from the governance apparatus's available tools for managing the organizational accountability situation the recording has created, and requires the most formally institutional and the most organizationally honest engagement with the specific coaching dynamics the recording most precisely documents. The third reason is the institutional governance implications. The governance apparatus's formal organizational accountability response to the most formally evidentiary single piece of coaching organizational documentation the Clark era has produced requires the most formally institutional and the most organizationally complete engagement with the coaching accountability story's most consequential evidentiary dimension. And the institutional governance implications of that required engagement are the most lasting single contribution the leaked recording makes to the coaching accountability story's most institutionally consequential organizational destination. The strongest counter-argument is that the leaked recording, however formally evidentiary in its audible documentation of coaching communications, reflects a specific and potentially isolated coaching communication situation that may not most accurately represent the full coaching and organizational dynamic the accountability story has been documenting, and that the shocking controversy characterization overstates the institutional significance of a single recorded coaching communication whose organizational context and complete content may not be fully captured in the publicly available portion of the leaked recording. That argument has genuine merit as an evidentiary completeness concern. The counter to the counter is that the formally evidentiary nature of the leaked recording is itself the most significant single contribution to the coaching accountability record, regardless of whether the publicly available portion captures the complete coaching communication context. Because the formal audibility and public irrefutability of the recording creates the organizational accountability situation whose institutional response requires the most formally institutional and the most organizationally honest engagement with the specific coaching dynamics the recording most precisely documents in its most publicly available and most formally evidentiary form. So, tell me in the comments right now, does the leaked recording of Stephanie White being caught represent the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development the Clark era has produced, and does the shocking Clark controversy the recording has sparked require the most formally institutional and the most organizationally complete governance accountability response the coaching accountability story has generated in its most consequential evidentiary dimension? Drop your answer, because this is the organizational accountability question, the most formally evidentiary single coaching accountability development the Clark era has produced.